Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker in Washington. We begin with a striking moment on the world stage and the latest indication of how seriously and significantly the relationships between the U.S. and its traditional partners and allies have frayed. Right now, world leaders are gathered in Germany for the annual Munich Security Conference. Ahead of the conference, organizers releasing their annual report, writing, quote, "The world has entered a period of wrecking ball politics," and goes on to label President Trump as one of the most prominent, quote, demolition men of global norms. And today, European leaders echoing that sentiment in their remarks, with the German chancellor saying the international rules-based order is being, quote, destroyed. And while his speech was largely in German, he did switch for a moment to speak in English to deliver this message to Washington.
In the era of great power rivalry, even the United States will not be powerful enough to go it alone. Dear friends, being a part of NATO is not only Europe's competitive advantage, it's also the United States' competitive advantage. So let's repair and revive transatlantic trust together. We, the Europeans, we are doing our part.
All eyes will be on Secretary of State Marco Rubio tomorrow to see how he responds when he addresses the forum. Remember, it was just a year ago when Vice President J.D. Vance delivered a scathing rebuke of the nation's European allies at the same conference, scolding European nations for not focusing on what he called, quote, the threat from within, and saying Europe's real problems was its mass migration policies. It comes as many allies and partners to the United States are questioning whether they can still trust the U.S. A new poll showing a plurality of respondents polled in Canada, Germany, France, and the UK say they do not believe the U.S. is a reliable ally. One of the biggest points of tension remains President Trump's desire to take over Greenland. Here's what he said about that today.
Well, I think Greenland's going to want us, but we get along very well with Europe. We'll see how it all works out. We're negotiating right now for Greenland.
Meanwhile, President Trump is also boosting the U.S. military presence in the Middle East, sending a second aircraft carrier to the region amid the ongoing tensions with Tehran. Here's more from the president today.
The second aircraft carrier that you decided to send, talk about why you made that choice.
Well, in case we don't make a deal, we'll need it. If we don't have a deal, we'll need it. If we have a deal, we could cut it short. It'll be leaving very soon. We have one out there that just arrived. If we need it, we have it ready. A very big force.
Joining me now, NBC News senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez, NBC senior national security correspondent Courtney Kube, and NBC News chief foreign affairs correspondent Andrea Mitchell. Both are in Munich, and also joining me is Sir Trevor Phillips, presenter at our sister network, Sky News. We're going to talk to Trevor Phillips in just a moment. But first, Gabe, I want to start with you. How do you anticipate the president will respond? How's the White House responding to some of those really stern words by European leaders?
Well, certainly, Kristen, look, at this point, he's ignoring it, right? You just played that clip from the president as he left for North Carolina earlier today, saying that he gets along fine with European leaders, even though there's been this ongoing friction, especially since that scathing speech just last month in Davos, where the president basically said that Europe would not exist if it weren't for the United States. Now, you mentioned Vice President J.D. Vance's speech last year in Munich, where he accused European leaders of essentially destroying their democracies. Well, between tariffs, between a whole lot of other controversial positions that the president has taken over the last year, the alliances have really been strained, of course, between the U.S. And Europe. And at this point, it doesn't seem like President Trump is backing down at all. He keeps reiterating how his friendships, how his relationships with these NATO allies are strong, that he's convinced them to pay more of their GDP for defense. So at this point, he does not seem to be concerned at all by these strong words from European leaders, Kristen.
So we're going to talk about this more with Courtney, but let me ask you, because we just played there, President Trump asked about sending a second aircraft carrier to the Middle East. He says it's in case we don't get a deal. What is the status of those talks, Gabe?
Well, the president today is touting some optimism, saying he thinks that these talks will eventually be successful. Unclear what he's pointing to there. But yes, he was asked about this second carrier strike group that he is sending to the Middle East as he ramps up pressure on Iran. And Kristen, this comes just several days after the president met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu here at the White House. This is something that, the White House is fresh off what it considers this huge victory in Venezuela, capturing Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro with this carrier with special forces and with this strike group in the region, in the Caribbean, certainly meaning to send a message to Iran that if these talks do not go well, to be prepared for the U.S. military to take action, Kristen.
Yeah, warning, no doubt there. Gabe Gutierrez at the White House for us. Gabe, thank you. Let's go to Munich now. Andrea, I want to start with you and let you set the scene within the context of that speech that Vice President J.D. Vance gave last year, that scathing rebuke of Europe. Andrea, how much is that hovering over this year's gathering?
It is an overwhelming shadow over this whole conference. It was why the Europeans were so resentful, and then the president doubled down in Davos. Sorry, we've been talking all day, but Courtney and I have been making the rounds. But the bottom line is, this year, it was viewed as a concession that Marco Rubio came and not J.D. Vance, as the president described the two potential successors competing right now, J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio, for the nod in 28. His embrace, he said, well, one is more diplomatic, and that clearly is Rubio. So they were expecting, and we were expecting, a rather conciliatory speech from Rubio tomorrow. Hard line in the context of the Trump world, but still embracing the multilateralism and NATO and the rest, and at least suggesting that the increase in NATO spending is one success. Now, a lot of us, not just the journalists, but senators in both parties, people here at the conference are wondering, because the conference itself, with the words you quoted, called the president the chief demolition man, and the destruction, of 80 years that has led to this. They're wondering whether Rubio, in the fashion of most of his cabinet compatriots, is going to now have to play to an audience of one, not the audience here, and ramp up the rhetoric in his speech tomorrow morning.
Well, Andrea, we know you've been working your sources there. No one works harder, so understandable that your voice is a little bit raspy. Courtney, let me turn to you. Pick up on what Andrea was saying, because there's actually new polling that shows people in countries that are traditionally viewed as U.S. allies, Courtney, no longer view the U.S. as a reliable partner. Are you getting that sense based on your conversations at the conference, Court?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that has really turned the tables here on that, you mentioned last year J.D. Vance with this speech that really came out of the blue and was met with stern reaction here at the conference last year. What's really changed even more than that is what's been happening with Greenland. I've been shocked by how many people are talking to us about Greenland right here during this conference. They were really struck by President Trump saying that he wants to take a sovereign country that is a NATO ally, and it has changed the way that Europeans have really looked at the United States when it comes to the U.S. as being a partner. And then when you add to that, just this week, there was a NATO defense ministers conference. Andrea was talking about how J.D. Vance is not here at the Munich Security Conference, which is uncommon not to have a vice president here. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth skipped his second NATO defense ministerial in a row. There's also a Ukraine Defense Contact Group. Instead, he sent his policy official, the number 3 person at the Pentagon, but that is not gone unnoticed here, that the United States, while they are saying that there is still a partnership with NATO, Bridge Colby, the Undersecretary for Policy, made it very clear that the partnership will no longer be a dependence on the United States. So the language is definitely shifted, but Greenland made a big difference here. There are people who are very concerned about the fact that the United States may still be interested, the Trump administration, in taking over a NATO ally, potentially even using the military to do so, Kristen.
Well, it's just fascinating that it is still so in focus. And of course, we pay such close attention to the optics of these types of conferences. So who's there and who's not, so significant. Court, I have to ask you about your reporting before I go back to Andrea. Of course, you reported overnight that the Pentagon is sending a second aircraft carrier to the Middle East. You just heard President Trump talking about that. He said, in case we can't get a deal with Iran. What are you hearing about the strategy there?
Yeah, so, I mean, they were notified yesterday, Thursday, that they would be heading to the Middle East. This is the USS Gerald R. Ford. It's down in the Caribbean right now. Everyone may remember that it was the one who was this was the carrier that was there on station during the operation to take Nicolas Maduro and his wife early last month. What's really striking to me about this, Kristen, is two things. Number one, this is a carrier that deployed last year to head to Europe, was rerouted down to the Caribbean, now is being sent back to CENTCOM. This is tough on the sailors, the men and women on the ship, the men and women on the associated ships there, because this means that their deployment is likely to be extended potentially by months. They have been at sea for months without a break. It's a tough deployment. This is tough news for those men and women, especially when it's not clear how long they'll be there. But the second thing is, why send a carrier? There's really two reasons. Number one is just the presence, right? It potentially presents a deterrent. It's potentially a show of force, a show of strength to Iran as these negotiations are ongoing. But it also provides to allies in the region who are very concerned about these tensions a sense of stability or support from the United States, that they're sending the second carrier there. Remember what an aircraft carrier is. People talk about it being a floating city. It's also a floating airport. It provides a huge amount of firepower, a huge amount of aircraft, if in fact the U.S. is going to go into Iran again.
Well, it's so fascinating to hear the perspective of the people actually on board that aircraft carrier. Andrea, final question to you. Put the broader Munich Security Conference into perspective. Historically, this is a significant moment. We know a lot of the potential 2028 contenders are there. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Governor Gavin Newsom, just to name a few. What are you going to be watching for over this weekend, these next few days?
They are trying to burnish their foreign policy connections, make an impact. The assembled world media is here, and make themselves look more presidential against the contrast of Donald Trump. And it's a very sharp contrast, and one that might be favorable for them here. But there's a lot of them, and there's a long way to 2028.
There certainly is, and I know you're both going to be incredibly busy as you continue to cover this historic conference. Andrea Mitchell, Courtney Kube, thank you both so much for joining me, starting us off today. Really appreciate it. Great reporting, of course. I want to go now to Sir Trevor Phillips. Thank you so much, as always, for joining me, as you always do on these significant days where we talk about the geopolitics between the U.S. and Europe. What are you going to be watching for at the security conference, and how much will Vice President J.D. Vance's speech from last year loom large over what happens?
Good afternoon, Kristen. It's lovely to talk to you as ever. Well, of course, J.D. Vance's intervention last year is still ringing in everybody's ears. The fact that Rubio is coming is, I don't know if you had in kindergarten a really nice teacher and then a really stern teacher. Last year we had Mr. Stern telling us, you know, you better be good, you've got to put your pocket money into defense and so on and so forth. And I think what we're expecting is that tomorrow we're getting Mr. Nice, Mr. Rubio, who's going to say, we're all partners, we all love each other, we're all together in support of Ukraine, and that actually, you know, there's nothing that's going to divide us. So I expect that though Rubio probably has his own political needs, the mission tomorrow will be to say to the Europeans, stay on board, stay with us, stick with us, and be part of what we need to do. And by the way, don't worry so much about Greenland. Now, we are bothered about Greenland. The United Kingdom is, in fact, sending new troops to Greenland, partly to, and you can expect to hear from our Prime Minister, to Mr. Rubio and Mr. Trump, look, we're putting a lot of troops in Greenland. You really don't need to worry. You don't need to own it. So cool it.
Well, all eyes are going to be on Secretary Rubio's remarks. There's no doubt about that. And it's fascinating to hear your expectations. We'll have to see if he matches those tomorrow. I do want to get your reaction to what we heard from German Chancellor Merz, who said the international rules-based order is being destroyed. Talk about the strategy behind sending that very firm message.
There is a lot of concern here in Europe that the international rules-based order, which essentially grew out of the Second World War as a way of preventing conflict, and which created institutions, the United Nations, the World Bank, and so on, that would create a situation where conflict was less likely. Now, what people are concerned about in Europe is that the White House, this White House, seems not too interested in the survival and flourishing of those institutions, or the rules of the international rules-based order. I have a particular view about this, which I've written about in the Times of London, which is I think people can get overstressed about this. The truth of the matter is that the international rules-based order has a first and overriding rule, and that is this: America makes the rules, and America makes the rules to suit itself. I think that all that's happened with Mr. Trump is that he's been less nice to us than previous presidents and told us the truth. But I don't think he's doing anything terrifically different. But what Friedrich Merz is trying to do is, particularly for European publics, to calm them down and make them feel less, if you like, talked down to by Mr. Trump. So the message that Merz is sending, I suspect, is as much to European people as it is to the White House.
I do have to get your take, Sir Trevor Phillips, on what I was just discussing with Andrea Mitchell, which is this notion that a number of the contenders, the Democratic contenders for 2028, are there in Munich, including Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She's offering her quote-unquote working class perspective of foreign policy. How do you anticipate that will be received in Europe and amongst the allies there?
Well, I think people will be interested, and it's a beauty parade, isn't it? That all of the contenders are, number one, telling the American public that they are big enough to be able to deal with international affairs as well as domestic affairs. So I guess what AOC is doing, as much as talking to foreigners in Munich, is she is speaking to the United States. And the pictures of her, which you're showing right now, I think are being beamed back into the United States as a video, if you like, that says, "Look at me, I'm with the big guys." I think that it will be received with interest because who knows, one day she may be a significant figure. But right now, it is really more of a sort of like Taylor Swift has turned up, really. Where it's glamorous, it's entertaining, it's interesting, but the real business is what Rubio is going to say tomorrow.
No doubt that's going to be the centerpiece. I do want to pivot and ask you on a different topic before I let you go about the fallout from the Epstein files there in the UK. There is a sense that Prime Minister Starmer could potentially not survive the level of backlash that he is getting because of the big names that have been mentioned in the Epstein files. What are you hearing about that? Where do you see this going?
This is very serious. It's very serious for our government. To try to give you a sense of what a big deal it is, some British names have been associated with Epstein. Everybody knows about the prince that used to be the artist that used to be known as Prince, now called Andrew Mountbatten, Windsor. We also have our ambassador to Washington, Lord Mandelson, who has had to step down because it was clear that he would not reveal the extent of his relationship and continuation of his friendship with Epstein when he was appointed by Starmer. And that has now created a problem for Starmer because people are saying, how could you not know? And how could you appoint, if you like, the associate of this man to represent our country in the most important country in the world? As a consequence of all of this, the dominoes have started to fall. The Prime Minister has now ambassador to Japan. You had lost part of your royal dynasty, the Kennedys, RFK, and then you'd lost Susie Wiles. And then there's going to be another 500,000 documents, which we know, which are going to be deposited in the next couple of weeks here. Who knows what's going to be in them? That is a calamity for Starmer. He was already, to some extent, in trouble. We have local elections this year, and the expectation is he's going to have a struggle to survive after that because the Labour Party is going to take a beating in the middle of this year.
Well, the tentacles of the Epstein files continue to be extraordinary in terms of their reach. So, Trevor Phillips, thank you for joining us, for your insights, especially about the Munich Security Conference. We really appreciate it. It's always great to see you.
Always a pleasure, Kristen. Great to talk to you.
See you soon. Thank you. We do want to go back to the White House now. We do have some breaking news to tell you about. The president just moments ago making new comments about Iran. Gabe Gutierrez joins us again. Gabe, thank you for sticking around for us. So what exactly did President Trump say about Iran?
Yeah, certainly some strong words about Iran here, Kristen. The president just leaving North Carolina en route to his Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida. He was asked about the possibility of regime change in Iran. And rather than swatting away the question, he did just respond saying, seems like that would be the best thing that could happen. For 47 years, they've been talking and talking and talking. In another answer, he said that he did express some frustration that the Iranian regime has been all talk but no action. Of course, this comes as the U.S. Expects to continue negotiations over Iran's nuclear program. Now, a reporter did ask, well, what would he who would replace the current Iranian government? The president said that he didn't want to talk about that. But, Kristen, certainly this is a president of the United States who does feel emboldened after his recent actions in Venezuela. And as we talked about earlier, now sending that second aircraft carrier group into the Middle East. And now for the using some strong language when it comes to threatening the Iranian regime that they don't come to the table and don't come to a deal here. There could be military action. And in his words, regime change could be the best thing that could happen, Kristen.
Wow. Well, just a striking comment there by President Trump. And, of course, foreign policy experts note regime change in Venezuela very different than Iran. Gabe Gutierrez, thank you. Stay with us. Come back if you get anything more. We really appreciate it.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.